They never found the bodies, only the rosaries buried deep in the walls, wrapped in cloth, soaked with blood, long since turned black. And the chapel bell? It kept ringing for 3 nights, long after the sisters were gone. This is not folklore, it's not fiction, this is real history, carefully buried and almost successfully erased. You're about to hear the first unfiltered account of what really happened at St. Mary's Convent, a place where mercy was promised but silence was enforced with ritual, where 23 women vanished, one by one, without a trace. You're not just listening to a story, you're entering a place where obedience was weaponized, devotion twisted, and power cloaked itself in the sacred. And once you cross this threshold, you won't see the church or the world the same again. In 1854, the Diocese of Milwaukee established St. Mary's Convent near the shores of Lake Michigan. Officially, it was a sanctuary, a holy place to educate orphans, tend to the sick, and spread Catholic charity across Wisconsin's Protestant-dominated frontier. But unofficially, it was a test site, a proving ground for a doctrine far older than Christianity, wrapped in the black silk of Irish habits and whispered prayers. What the Church won't tell you, what even most of its faithful never realize, is that certain religious orders operated under ancient pre-Christian codes, codes of silence, codes of sacrifice. And at St. Mary's, those codes weren't just preserved, though they were enforced. The convent was built on land purchased from a dying lumber baron whose journals, only discovered in 1994, mentioned strange lights over the chapel site long before construction began. "They sing in tongues I cannot write," he scrawled, "and the ground is always warm where the sisters now kneel." But the land wasn't the only problem. The women who arrived, mostly young, mostly Irish, aim-seeking purpose. They found instead a labyrinth of obedience rituals, dietary restrictions, and psychological confinement. The bell rang 7 times daily, but it wasn't just to mark prayer. It was a signal system, a kind of behavioral programming, slowly reshaping the minds of those within the limestone walls. And within a year, they began to disappear. Not in groups, not in ways that could be blamed on travel, transfers, or illness. No, they vanished one at a time, always quietly, always without warning, and always without a body. They say God sees all. But at St. Mary's, no one was watching. Or worse, they were. By spring of 1856, 5 nuns were gone. No funerals, no announcements, no written transfers, just sudden absence, like the wind had erased their footprints from the convent floor. But what made it worse was how the others responded. They didn't mourn. They didn't question. They simply adjusted. Witnesses, former pupils and one runaway novice, described a chilling stillness that followed each disappearance. No investigation, no change in routine, just silence and prayer. As if the absence of a human soul required nothing more than another Hail Mary and a tightening of the veil. The head of the convent, Mother Elodia, was a figure cloaked in mystery even during her lifetime. Born in County Sligo, Ireland, she arrived in Wisconsin with an already fractured history. Some claimed she'd once been excommunicated in Dublin, others whispered she had no ecclesiastical record at all, but in every account one detail persisted: her eyes. Described as pale grey, nearly white, they seemed to glow in candlelight, according to an orphan who later spoke under hypnosis. Another girl, committed to an asylum in 1871, repeatedly screamed in Latin, a language she was never taught, claiming She never blinked, even in the dark. Mother Elodia enforced strict spiritual discipline, rooted not in Christian love but in ancient mystic rites. She introduced midnight reflection sessions, solitary hours spent kneeling in pitch blackness before a sealed door she called the threshold of correction. The room behind it? Bricked shut. No one was ever seen entering or leaving. Then came the drawings. Hidden inside the hymnals, investigators decades later found folded scraps of parchment, sketched by nervous, trembling hands. Circles within circles, eyes with no pupils, a figure with antlers cloaked in ash. It wasn't the Virgin Mary they were worshipping, not anymore. But why did the Church step in? Because they knew. Letters from the Vatican archive, briefly released during the 1970s and immediately reclassified, referenced unorthodox experiments in American convents. They spoke of containment practices, personality disintegration rituals, and the application of pre-baptismal hierarchies. In short, the Church had sanctioned something, or someone, and St. Mary's was their test chamber. In 1857, Sister Joan attempted to flee. She ran barefoot into the woods during an early frost, half-starved and covered in bite marks. Her final words before death? Scribbled in blood on a piece of birch bark. The Virgin is not who you think she is. What lived in that chapel wore holiness like a mask. The townspeople had their suspicions, of course. You don't live downwind from a place like St. Mary's without catching the scent of something wrong. Children spoke of the bells ringing at impossible hours. 3:17 a.m., 4:44 a.m., with no one pulling the ropes. Hunters swore the deer wouldn't step within a mile of the grounds, and old men in taverns whispered of nights when the fog moved in reverse, crawling up from the river instead of down. But the local clergy, silent, bought, or terrified? Probably both. By 1861, the convent's reputation had spread beyond Wisconsin. A few daring journalists, mostly young, idealistic and naive, tried to expose what they called monastic abuses. None of their articles were published. One reporter from Chicago, named Ellis Fry, was found disoriented on the side of the railroad tracks just 5 miles from St. Mary's. His notebook contained only one legible phrase scrawled over and over. They don't pray to her, they feed her. In those days, female convents were rarely inspected. They were autonomous, sacred spaces protected under ecclesiastical law, which made them the perfect hiding places. For rituals, for relics, for anything the Church needed removed from sight. And yet, there were cracks. In 1864, a maintenance worker, a Protestant man named Samuel Halberd, was hired to repair part of the chapel floor after a fire. He lasted 3 days. On the 4th, he refused to re-enter the building and walked back to town barefoot, leaving all his tools behind. He died a month later in his sleep, but not before leaving a final account with his daughter. He said there was a sub-basement beneath the convent, not on any blueprints, accessible only through a trapdoor in the sacristy, covered with a marble slab. He claimed he was taken down there by 2 silent nuns and made to work by lantern light. He said he saw cages he sat in, and he heard something breathing behind the stone walls, something huge. But what chilled him most? The prayers. The nuns didn't chant in Latin, not even Aramaic. The words were older, cruder, not sung but hummed. And whenever the humming started, he said the walls would pulse. Pulse. Like a womb, like something deep inside was listening and growing. That wasn't a convent anymore. It was a chamber, a sanctuary, a gestation site, and what it was nurturing was not human. In the spring of 1867, the Vatican quietly dispatched a man to St. Mary's. His name was Father Domenico Serra, and he wasn't just a priest. He was an inquisitor of the Index, one of the last remaining theological investigators trained in forbidden doctrine, a ghost in the Church's own house. His mission wasn't public. It wasn't even written. Serra operated under a vow of silence and worked only on matters deemed pre-Constantinian, heresies that predated the Council of Nicaea. These were not doctrinal disputes. These were ancient, flesh-and-blood threats. He arrived under the guise of a visiting scholar, claiming interest in the convent's rare Marian relics. The Mother Superior greeted him with grace and warmth, but her eyes, Serra later wrote, were glassy and stretched too wide, like something was holding her skull from the inside. Serra stayed for 11 days. On the 12th, he vanished. His last correspondence, a sealed letter sent by courier to the Archdiocese of Milwaukee, arrived opened and torn. Most of the pages were missing, but the final fragment survived, water-stained and smudged in blood. It read, "The Virgin here is not the mother of Christ. She is the mother of something else. Something born before language. The nuns have inverted the ritual. It is no longer transubstantiation. It is transference. Something is passing through them daily. They are not brides of God. They are midwives." The Church, fearing scandal and the loss of control over rural orders, sealed the investigation. Serra was declared lost in travel, and St. Mary's was granted a renewed charter. But a map of the grounds, drawn by Serra himself and recovered from a hidden Vatican archive years later, revealed something terrifying. He had marked the convent not as a place of worship, but as a site of convergence, a geomantic point of extreme spiritual gravity where lines of ancient pre-Christian energy met in a spiral. A place, he noted, where the veil between worlds wears thin. He even labelled the convent chapel with a single Latin word, partus, birth. What did he mean by that? Not metaphor, not prophecy. Serra meant literal emergence, the key, gateway, a womb of flesh and shadow, where something waited to step through. And the nuns, they weren't lost. They were vessels. In 1871, 4 years after Father Serra's disappearance, a government land surveyor named Benjamin Harrow was dispatched to western Kentucky. His assignment was mundane: update the boundary maps for several counties, including the tract on which St. Mary's Convent stood. Harrow was a rational man, a veteran of the Civil War turned cartographer. He believed in topography, geology, and paperwork, not in superstition. But the journal he kept during those months tells another story. It was never published. It was never meant to be. But in 1928, a relative found it sealed in a cedar box behind a false panel in an attic in Owensboro. What it contains is harrowing. Harrow wrote that upon arriving near St. Mary's, his compass began to spin erratically. His horse refused to step onto the convent's main path. Birds flew in circles overhead. Trees leaned unnaturally inward, as if something at the centre was pulling them. The convent itself appeared abandoned. No voices, no movement, no visible nuns, and yet the chapel bell rang every day at noon, perfectly on time, for no one. When Harrow approached the main door, he saw words etched into the stone above the archway. They were in Latin. Vitam in utero tenemus. We hold life in the womb. He entered. The halls were lined with portraits of the Virgin Mary, but each painting was subtly different. In one, her eyes were black pits. In another, her hands were reversed. One showed her cradling a child, but the infant's face had no features. Harrow explored the lower chambers and found what he described as a room of red stone, older than the building itself. The floor was engraved with a spiral, just like Sarah's map, and at its center, a stone basin filled not with water, but with salt. He took samples. He tried to leave, but the moment he stepped outside the building, he found the landscape altered, trees in new play, as the path behind him gone. Harrow wandered for 3 days. When he finally made it back to town, his hair had gone white. He resigned from the Survey Commission a week later. His official report, filed with the state, reads only one line. Convent unreachable, coordinates unstable, recommend removal from future maps. He was ignored. But Harrow's last journal entry is chilling. They are not missing, they are not gone, they are becoming. I saw them. In the salt, in the spiral, they are not praying, they are preparing. In 1893, a physician named Dr. Lowell Cairn arrived in the region under the pretense of studying postnatal mortality in isolated religious communities. But Dr. Cairn had another motive. He was a quiet disciple of a fringe movement in early American medicine known as psychobiotic theory, the belief that trauma, belief, and environment could alter not just the mind, but the biology of the unborn. He had heard rumors of women at St. Mary's birthing stillborn twins who didn't rot, infants with ossified eyes, infants that moved before breath. A midwife in the region claimed to have seen a child born wrapped in a membranous veil, speaking Latin in guttural tones, before its father drowned it in the creek and walked into the forest, never returning. Cairn was a scientist, but not a skeptic. He believed that madness was just knowledge that hadn't found its structure yet, so he rented a home nearby, set up his instruments, and gained access to the convent under the guise of free medical service. He treated 11 women in his first 2 months. 10 were silent. No eye contact, no vocalization. The 11th, Sister Constance, was different. She spoke to him freely. Too freely. She told him that the nuns no longer prayed to Christ, that something else had come, something below the convent. She said they no longer menstruated. Their cycles had stopped 5 years prior. Replaced by dreams. Rhythmic, synchronized dreams. Of tunnels. Of music without sound. Of salt that moved on its own. Cairn asked her if she'd seen any children. Her eyes filled with tears. She whispered, "Not children, echoes." He took blood samples, found anomalies, no immune response, flat hormone levels, but elevated salinity, salt content nearly triple that of the human norm. He returned one night, weeks later, to repeat the tests. The convent was empty, no doors locked, no bodies found. Candles still burning, beds still warm. 11 rooms, 11 nuns. Gone. On the wall of the largest chamber, he found the spiral, not painted but grown in a dark, salt-like crust that had pushed through the stone. Pulsing, he fled. Days later, his medical report was found nailed to the door of a church in Danville. It read, "If they were human, they are no longer. The womb is not the origin, it is the door. Dr. Cairn vanished the following week. The townspeople said nothing. Not about the nuns, not about the salt spiral, not about the low, rhythmic hum that had begun to tremble through the hills on windless nights, and certainly not about the children, those strange, grey-eyed orphans that began appearing in nearby counties within the year. But there was one man who kept the truth alive, Father Rourke, an excommunicated priest who had once served at St. Mary's before its strange transformation. He drank himself toward death in a cabin near Harrodsburg, muttering to anyone who'd listen about the inversion of light and the mistaken birth. In 1895, a group of Catholic officials from Louisville attempted to reclaim the convent. They arrived with surveyors, 2 monks, and a civil engineer. Only one returned, the youngest, a mapmaker named Elias Dunn. He walked into a Lexington church barefoot, dehydrated and bloodied at the fingertips. When asked what had happened, he whispered, "We were not above it. We were inside it. The convent is not a building, it's a shell." He never spoke again. He died months later in a sanitarium, having scratched hundreds of concentric spirals into his cell walls, all with his own teeth. The Vatican sealed the land, officially declared it unsanctified by human violence, a term used only 3 times in church history. They buried it beneath a private land trust and rerouted the county roads. For decades, it faded from public memory. But local hunters still speak of strange mists that move against the wind, of deer that walk in perfect concentric circles, of music that plays in the stomach, not the ears, and always of that salt, black, glistening, and warm. Then, in 1922, something resurfaced. A box, iron rusted and locked tight, unearthed by a construction crew digging a railway line 5 miles from the site. Inside were pages, hundreds of them, all handwritten by Dr. Cairn. The writings weren't medical notes. They were instructions, rituals, coordinates, diagrams of the female reproductive system, overlaid with topographic maps of the Kentucky hills. And on the final page, "They are not nuns, they are vessels, and they are not gone. They are waiting." The box disappeared before it reached authorities. The rail line was diverted. But the files, copies, began to circulate, quietly, among certain circles, not conspiracy theorists, but scientists, and they were afraid. In 1937, a physicist named Dr. Ernest Volman, Bollaetzian, formerly of Los Alamos, began to speak cryptically at closed seminars about wombs as receivers. He wasn't speaking biologically, he meant something else and something spatial. He believed the female body, under specific arcane conditions, could bridge dimensions. He never cited sources. But privately, Volman kept a collection, newspaper clippings about the vanished nuns, sketches of spiraled hills, a single carbon copy of Dr. Cairn's final page, labeled KY Birthing Site 3A. That same year, Volman was found dead in his basement laboratory. No signs of trauma, just a circle of burned salt around his reclining chair. The autopsy found his brain entirely smooth, as if something had erased it. And yet his notes survived. In one passage he wrote, "Birth is not creation. Birth is arrival. If one calls to the wrong corridor, what answers may not be human." Decades passed. The region remained silent. But the pattern, the spiral, kept reappearing. 71. A sinkhole opens near the original site. Surveyors find not rock or earth, but walls, tiled clean and covered in hand-carved Latin. The shaft is sealed within days. No photos ever released. 89. A hiker disappears in the hills. The search team reports oddities, animal corpses arranged in clockwise spirals, and an unnatural silence, not even insects. They call it acoustic dead space. 7. A college student researching Catholic land trusts stumbles on Vatican records that reference SM Initiate site. She vanishes before her thesis defense. Her roommate reports she had developed an obsession with old birth records from 1856 to 1859, all from one orphanage in northern Kentucky. Every child was born on the same day. Every child had grey eyes. Every birth listed the mother as unknown, delivered via proxy at St. Mary's. Today, the land is overgrown, quiet, and no signage. But certain satellite photos taken under thermal imaging show a temperature anomaly, a faint spiral, invisible to the eye, still radiating heat. Not from sunlight, but from within. Locals avoid the area, not out of superstition, but instinct. Dogs refuse to enter the nearby woods. Compasses spin wildly in a 300-yard radius. And occasionally, on windless nights, there's a hum, not from above, but beneath your feet, as if something is breathing, slowly, patiently, and waiting for the next signal. There's a phrase whispered among the remaining elderly sisters from nearby parishes. Women now in their 90s, cloistered in rural Kentucky, their memories brittle with time and fear. They call it the night of the mirror birth. It happened, supposedly, on December 17th, 1858. The records are gone, scrubbed, rewritten, misfiled under unrelated parish names. But the oral history remains, passed in fragments, in code, in confession. A child was born that night, or something like a child. Witnesses claimed it was silent, no cries, no breath. But its eyes opened immediately, grey and dilated, and locked onto the face of a nun named Sister Agnes. She fell dead on the spot, no wounds, no disease, only her mouth frozen in a soundless scream. They buried her within the hour. No service, no cross. The infant? Taken, not to a nursery, but beneath the convent, to a sub-level that no blueprints ever confirmed. Former janitors referred to it simply as the Red Door. Said they were warned never to open it, said they heard low chants behind it, said the air near it felt thick. A year later, 7 nuns vanished. The Mother Superior at the time, Sister Josephina, wrote one final letter, not to the Vatican, but to a retired bishop in Rome. We were meant to guard the threshold, not cross it, but something has come through. It wears the shape of a child, but it is not born. It was summoned. The bishop died before responding. Then silence. For decades. Until 1952, when a fire, officially blamed on faulty wiring, consumed half the convent. But survivors tell a different story. They say a hidden chamber was breached by a construction team repairing pipes. They say something moved down there. Fast, unseen. And suddenly, the walls bled, not metaphorically, literally. The fire didn't spread from the wiring, it spread from below, from beneath the chapel itself, where the Red Door had once stood. No bodies were recovered. Only one artifact survived, a scorched wooden plaque found buried under the rubble. It read, "The mirror must not open twice." To this day, that phrase appears nowhere in Catholic doctrine, nowhere in Scripture, But in the margins of an ancient apocryphal text, the Gospel of the Watchers, there's a single line: "The ones who pass through the mirror shall mimic flesh, but not possess soul." The question is not who opened the door, it's whether it was ever closed. It was thought that time would bury the past, that the ruin of St. Mary's would fade into overgrown ivy, forgotten records, and polite denials. But it didn't. The ruin resisted silence, like a wound that refused to close. And then came the sightings. In 1967, a group of college students from Louisville broke into the sealed grounds of the old convent as part of a hazing ritual. Only 2 of the 5 made it back. One was catatonic, the other incoherent. All he managed to say was, "She doesn't blink. She's still wearing the veil." They were never charged with trespassing. Police quietly closed the report, but the story spread and grew. Locals whispered of a nun in black wandering the woods at night, humming hymns in reverse. Her veil, they said, didn't hang. It floated, as if submerged in water. Her hands were too long, and her face blurred like a smudged mirror. Those who followed her vanished, only to be found months later in locked barns and sealed basements, eyes wide open, mouths filled with rosary beads. Not metal ones, bone. The Catholic diocese dismissed these as rural hysteria, but they knew more than they admitted. In 1971, a secret delegation of exorcists visited the ruins of St. Mary's under cover of night. No press, no witnesses. But one of the exorcists, Father Louis Ardente, kept a hidden journal. Entry, March 4th, 1971. The ground is wrong. Prayers do not lift here. We found a fresco beneath the chapel floor. 7 women kneeling around a crib. But the crib was empty. And behind them, a mirror. Not reflecting, but absorbing light. As if it fed on our presence. 3 days later, Father Ardente was found in Rome, blind, trembling, and repeating one phrase over and over. "It's learning how to speak." From that point on, the Vatican sealed every record of St. Mary's, not just the convent, but the founding order itself, the sisters, the 7 wounds erased from archives, denied in public, and labelled apocryphal by church authorities. But it didn't end. Because if you walk the woods near the ruins today, if you stand still just before dawn, you might hear it. A lullaby, in Latin, sung by a voice that's neither male nor female. A voice too old to belong to anything living, and if you listen long enough, it sings your name. By the early 1980s, the surrounding counties treated St. Mary's like a ghost limb, something that had once been alive but was now amputated from memory. Property developers wouldn't touch the land, surveyors refused to map it, and the clergy remained silent. But silence has weight. It builds, and eventually it breaks. In 1983, a local archivist named Joan Keller, working independently, began investigating the unexplained disappearances tied to the convent. She wasn't a paranormal researcher or a conspiracy theorist. She was methodical, rational. Her specialty was tracking old land titles and diocesan property shifts. What she found terrified her. Between 1843 and 1930, the Catholic Church had quietly absorbed 41 parcels of land surrounding St. Mary's, most of them from families who had suffered tragedies, fires, suicides, children reported missing, all swept under legal finality, and always followed by sudden transfers of land rights to the diocese. No disputes, no resistance. Joan dug deeper. She discovered a letter, never meant to be public, from the Bishop of Lexington to the Archbishop of New York, dated 1929. It read, "We have honored the pact. Their rituals are no longer visible, but they remain heard. What was opened must not be disturbed. We await further instruction." Pact, rituals, open. She cross-referenced the date. 3 days earlier, a coal miner had collapsed into an unmarked shaft near the old convent property and reportedly saw a choir of women in stone robes, standing still, eyes open in the dark. Joan documented everything, made copies, wrote a manuscript. She mailed one to a historian at the University of Chicago, another to a Jesuit contact in Boston. Neither arrived. Joan herself vanished in February of 1984. Her car was found outside the ruins of St. Mary's, doors locked, keys in the ignition. Inside, police found only a single cassette recording. The audio, still archived in unofficial circles, runs for 7 minutes. No speech, no music, just whispers. Not chaotic, but organized, like a liturgy made of breath. On the final second of the tape, a voice, clear and cold, cuts through. "She was not yours to name." The case was closed again. And the name Joan Keller was never printed in any official diocesan correspondence. But in the margins of her last notes, scribbled in a trembling hand, was one final question. What if they were never nuns? The deeper you dig into the mystery of St. Mary's, the more the story resists resolution. You begin to sense that the truth isn't buried, it's sealed, and what lies beneath isn't just forgotten history, it's something else. In the spring of 1987, a group of theology students from Louisville attempted to document what remained of the convent. They weren't ghost hunters. These were scholars, ambitious and skeptical, hoping to publish a thesis debunking rural religious hysteria. They brought audio recorders, video cameras, EM field meters, thinking this would be their footnote in history. They were wrong. Within 20 minutes of arriving at the site, their instruments began failing, not all at once, but in sequence, like someone was shutting them down deliberately. Footage from the first hour still exists, and it is wrong. Not in content, but in structure. Time appears disjointed, shadows moving independently of their sources, light stuttering in natural daylight, audio reversing and looping without cue. They left before dusk, visibly shaken. One of them, Thomas Wren, refused to speak for months afterward. When he did, all he would say was, "They were still praying. They've always been praying." But praying to what? The few transcripts we have from the convent's early days mention an Order of the Hollow Veil, a subsect of monastic practice never recognized by the Vatican. Their doctrine spoke not of God, but of silence as a divine entity, not the absence of sound, but an intelligent silence, a watcher, a mirror, a mouth that never opens because it has nothing to say to you, only to those who belong to it. The women of St. Mary's didn't preach salvation. They meditated on unbecoming. They believed identity itself was a prison, name, memory, voice, all obstacles to merging with what they called the lifeless bride. Some suggest that the nuns weren't taken or kidnapped. You'd think the silence surrounding St. Mary's would discourage further inquiry. But for those who've stared into its depths, silence doesn't feel like emptiness. It feels like invitation. In 1993, a freelance journalist named Emery Holt disappeared after visiting the site. His car was found neatly parked along the gravel service road, keys in the ignition, a crucifix hanging from the rearview mirror, broken clean in half. His notebook was discovered beneath the passenger seat, containing only one entry. They do not whisper. They stare. His disappearance was never officially connected to St. Mary's, but his wife insisted Emery had uncovered something, an altar beneath the convent. Something made of red stone, polished, ancient, older than the church itself. She described symbols etched into its surface, curves that seemed to squirm when looked at too long, and an eye, not drawn, but grown into the stone, like it had been waiting. This lines up with the only surviving floor plan of the convent, an early architectural draft from 1871. The original blueprint marks a room beneath the chapel simply labelled the chamber. No access points, no description, no records of it ever being consecrated or used. But it's there, always has been. Local legend claims the nuns would enter the main chapel once a month, barefoot and silent, and disappear behind the altar for 3 days. No food, no water, no talking, just vanishing. When they returned, they were different, eyes glassy, movements synchronized. They would not respond to their names for days, as if they had forgotten them or surrendered them. There are still people in the surrounding counties who refuse to speak of the convent aloud. They won't drive by it, won't let their children near it. Not out of superstition, but out of recognition. Because they remember what it feels like to be watched from inside your own mind. Now see, this was never about faith. This was about exchange. The nuns didn't worship a god, they fed something. With memory, with voice, with identity. They poured themselves into that red altar like a living tithe, until they became nothing. And nothing is precisely what that place is built to protect. You may still walk the grounds, but do so quietly. Because if you speak too loud, it might answer back. The official records say the convent closed in 1963 due to structural instability. That's the narrative offered by the diocese. A quiet ending, bureaucratic, clean. But what really happened that year shattered more than just stone. It began with a sound heard by farmers in the nearby hills, a low, vibrating hum that persisted for 4 days straight. Livestock refused to eat. Dogs wailed at nothing. One man, a retired miner, described it as a frequency I could feel in my teeth. Then came the fire. Not smoke, not flames, but a kind of heat that warped the air around the convent steeple. Witnesses claimed the cross at the top began to bend downward, like it was being pulled from above, and then, without warning, it snapped and fell with a sound that wasn't metal, but more like a scream. Father Darren Calloway was sent to investigate. He was young, loyal, the kind of man who thought evil wore horns and could be rebuked with a prayer. He never made it past the chapel doors. When they found him, he was kneeling on the stone floor, eyes open, unmoving, mouth stuffed with torn-out pages from his own Bible. He lived for 6 more years. Never spoke again. But every morning, without fail, he would write the same line on the walls of his cell. She's still singing below. Who is she? Some say it refers to Mother Aveline, the final head of the convent, last seen leading a procession of sisters into the basement on the night the fire began. None of them ever emerged. The church declared them lost in a spiritual tragedy. But others, the ones who know better, say she wasn't leading them, she was offering them. You see, there are rituals older than Catholicism, older than Scripture, acts that require choir, sacrifice, and blind obedience, and when all three are offered at once, something begins to awaken. In the last photo ever taken inside St. Mary's before it was sealed, you can see the altar room, dust everywhere, walls cracked, but on the far wall, just above the sealed stone archway, there's a handprint, too large for any human, pressed outward from the inside. Next we go deeper, into the sealed chamber itself. The door was sealed with 7 bolts of iron, etched with Latin scripture, long faded by time and water. Not the kind of door meant to keep people out, but to keep something else in. It wasn't part of the original convent design. In fact, no architectural records mention a subchamber beneath St. Mary's. And yet, there it was. For decades, the church called it the foundation room. But those who spoke off the record, custodians, stonemasons, even a few shaken priests, used a different name: the voice cellar. 2 men were assigned to breach it in 1964 under strict Vatican silence. One of them, Walter Edgecombe, never made it back up. The other, Harris Flynn, returned. Changed. He wouldn't speak of what he saw, but he recorded one phrase over and over in his journal. It didn't want to be found, but it knew we were coming. Inside, the floor was layered in ash, not dust. Ash, charred symbols lined the walls in a language that predated Latin, Greek, even Aramaic. In the center, a pulpit. But not for preaching, for channeling. Covered in scratches and indentations that looked eerily like knees, elbows, foreheads. As if generations had knelt there, screaming prayers into the earth. And then there was the well. Perfectly round, 5 feet wide, no ladder, no visible bottom. Just a black shaft that drank light like a starving animal. Sound engineer James Caldwell dropped a stone into it during an acoustic test. It never hit the bottom. But the audio device recorded something else. A female voice, whispering, backward. When reversed, the words were clear. You opened it again. He still breathes. Who he was remains unconfirmed. Some believe it referred to the Watcher, a pre-Christian deity tied to underground shrines, known to demand silence, submission, and song. Others believe it was simply madness, collective delusion, an echo chamber of trauma from a century of ritual abuse. But here's the part they couldn't explain away. 3 months after the chamber was opened, 7 nuns across different convents in the state of Kentucky went missing. No note, no signs of struggle. Each one had written the same sentence in her diary before vanishing. The voice calls from below. No bodies were ever found. And yet, late at night, in that sealed chamber beneath St. Mary's, motion sensors still pick up movement. Slow, rhythmic, like someone walking in circles, waiting. They thought sealing the chamber would end it, that bricks and steel could smother something older than fear itself. In 1971, a Vatican-sanctioned team encased the entire sublevel beneath 30 feet of reinforced concrete. The chapel above it was rededicated, the records were scrubbed. The last surviving priest who had entered the voice cellar was moved to a cloister in northern Italy, where he took a vow of silence and never spoke again. But silence isn't safety. Because it never needed sound to reach you, it only needed agreement. The convent grounds were eventually sold. In 1997, a private religious school moved in, unaware of what lay beneath the soil. Within months, faculty began reporting auditory hallucinations. A teacher claimed she heard a girl humming a lullaby in the janitor's closet. A groundskeeper found a rosary melted into a solid lump of iron, no heat source nearby. One student disappeared during a fire drill. Security footage showed her walking toward the chapel basement. There was no basement on record. What's more disturbing is what resurfaced in 2019 when construction crews expanding the East Wing unearthed a stone idol. Roughly human, female, eyeless, kneeling, carved into its chest, an inverted cross within a spiral of tongues. Carbon dating placed it at 1200 BCE, pre-Christian, pre-European. Local tribes never spoke of it. But a hidden document, written by a Jesuit scholar and locked away in the Vatican archives, calls her Sangua Domina, the Lady Beneath. Supposedly worshipped by an early Christian splinter sect that believed holiness was born not of light, but of buried pain. The nuns weren't just victims, they were vessels, conditioned to suppress every instinct, every doubt, every cry, until their minds became the perfect medium for something else to speak through, not possession, partnership. And those who vanished, they didn't run, they descended, not metaphorically, physically, into a hollow that predated the convent itself, into her lungs, into the breath of an entity that still waits beneath Kentucky's cracked foundations, feeding off silence, off secrets, off songs sung in trembling obedience. The convent may be gone, the Vatican may deny, but still, at 3:33 a.m., hikers near the ruins report the same thing.